Welcome to Massey Dialogue. Bienvenue. My name is Nathalie Desrosiers and I'm the principal of Massey College. And it's my pleasure and privilege to invite you at Massey College for this great conversation that we'll have on Brexit then and now. So I just want to first acknowledge that Massey College is built on Indigenous lands, the lands of the Huon-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. It is the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And we want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship toward this land and the great privilege that we have to continue to do our work here. So I just want to, I'm very grateful for the audience to be here and to continue this series on Massey Dialogue. I will pass the mic to our moderator, Nala Ayed, who is a well-known journalist who's perfectly well-placed to be leading us in this discussion. I want to thank her for taking the time from her busy schedule from doing this. And I also want to thank our guests that she will introduce to just lead us. We're all very keen to know, because we've been thinking about this, how could it have happened and what's the next step? So merci beaucoup d'être ici. Welcome.
Thank you very much for that really warm welcome, Nathalie. Very good to see all of you. And I wish I were with you in person, but I'm really honored to be a part of this. And I'm pleased to be here with you to help guide this conversation. When you consider the pace of events in recent years, the fire hose of headlines from the United Kingdom and around the world, it's really hard to believe that it's actually only been 5.5 years since the UK voted to leave the European Union. Since we, the journalists who were covering the event in London that historic night, scrambled to catch up to a story that had gotten ahead of all of us and to make sense of it all. Now, far removed from the shock and the exuberance of that night, promises have turned into questions and warnings have become I told you so's. And so ongoing in the UK itself is a constant reckoning with the veracity of a multitude of claims. And just as it was back then, underlying that discussion is a fundamental disagreement over the truth. So where is this all heading? With us to discuss Brexit then and now is Sir Graham Watson. He is currently Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the University of Toronto's Monk School of Global Affairs. He was the first UK Liberal ever to be elected to the European Parliament in 1994. And in 2012, he became the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe, or ALDE, party president. During his 20 years in the European Parliament, he co-founded and chaired the Climate Parliament. And also he published along the way his 10th book, Building a Liberal Europe. And in 2011, he was knighted in the Queen's Birthday Honours List. He served as ALDE president until 2016, stepping down to devote his energies to the EU referendum campaign in the UK. Also with us, and known very well to the audience, I'm sure, is Mel Kapp. He is professor at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. He was, of course, High Commissioner for Canada to the United Kingdom during the years 2002 and 2006. He also served as Clerk of the Privy Council, Secretary to Cabinet and Head of Public Service, and as President of the Institute for Research on Public Policy. He is an officer of the Order of Canada and a recipient of the Queen's Diamond and Golden Jubilee medals. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks.
Thank you. So Graham, I'd like to kick off with you with a few remarks from you, if possible. And here's the main question, I suppose, that we're considering. In this, the early phase of quote unquote living with Brexit, when you look at the big picture, how do the promises of 2016 stand up or measure up to the reality?
Well, I think, unfortunately, but as many predicted, the promises are not measuring up to the reality at all. Boris Johnson famously promised the business community in Northern Ireland that there would be no change as a result of Brexit. There has been huge change. The supermarkets are short of food. The Spirit Drink Federation is saying there will not be enough wine and spirits available at Christmas. For many people who believed they would be better off, they found, in fact, they're worse off. It's harder for them to travel. It's harder for them to spend time on the continent. They no longer have access to all kinds of European Union programs. I think it's important, Nala, not to underestimate how big a break this is. I mean, this is on a par with Russia 1917 or Germany 1933, not in terms of the number of people who have died, but in terms of the rupture with the past. And in UK history, you probably have to go back to 1649, when Oliver Cromwell chopped the head off King Charles I, to find a similar rupture. That was followed by 10 years of military dictatorship. I hope that will not be our fate on this occasion.
Thank you very much for that. If I could just have a very quick follow-up with you. As Natalie said in starting this conversation, the question that still remains after 5.5 years and probably will stay with us for quite some time is just looking back now, more than 5 years after the vote, is there any greater insight as to the prime motivating factor behind the decision of so many British to choose an exit from the EU?
I think we now know that it was the re-emergence of English nationalism, which had been buried under empire, egged on by the newspapers, which caused the problem, as it were. Combine that with the frustrations of some of the wide boys in the financial services industry in the City of London, the hedge funds, the derivative markets, who did not wish to be overseen and controlled by Brussels in the public interest. And you have an explosive combination. And of course, they came together with Steve Bannon and the people who were planning Trump's campaign in the United States and wanted to test out their new algorithms on a large sample of people. And so the UK referendum campaign became the test bed for the Trump election campaign 6 months later.
You mentioned the words, or you used the words, a rupture with the past, and you know, harkening back to a violent period that you cited. I wonder if you think that more British people are aware today of the significance of this decision, the fact that it was such a rupture with the past, and that it perhaps isn't as rosy as some had hoped it would be.
Well, the opinion polls would suggest that more people now think Brexit was a mistake than think it was a good thing. But of course, you have to look at the vote at the time. In Scotland and in Northern Ireland, you had a vote clearly against leaving the European Union, as you did in London and in places like Oxford and Cambridge. But in other parts of England, the vote was very heavily in favor. And what had happened, I think, is that the global elite, the people who worry more about the end of the world than they do about the end of the month, had allowed inequalities and frustrations to build up over many years. And you could say the real failure with Brexit was a failure of leadership by the political class. If you look at the Stronger In campaign, the campaign to persuade people to stay in, led by David Cameron and Peter Mandelson and people, they left no mistake unmade. They failed totally to develop a narrative which convinced people of the reasons for staying in.
Mm-hmm. How would you were involved also in the campaign to remain, and so I wonder how you would have changed the message.
Well, I was on a council set up by Lord Sainsbury to prepare it. I have to say that along with John Kerr, who was one of our representatives to the European Union, I submitted a minority report. We disagreed with the thrust of the campaign, which was to say, oh, don't say anything good about Europe, just say how damaging it would be if we left. And of course, that is not the kind of narrative that wins a campaign. On the side that wanted to get us out, we had both the technology to win the war supplied by Bannon and the Trump campaign. We had the narrative supplied by Dominic Cummings, take back control, even though, of course, the European Union is all about countries coming together and taking back control. And at the same time, we had people who were prepared to give it credence, like Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, for their own political advantage, agreeing to lead that campaign. And those were the factors, I fear, that led us into that disastrous vote. And folk are now waking up to the consequences of what happened.
Thank you for that. Melcap, I'd like to bring you in here to start sort of the conversation. But before we do that, just your own thoughts. So you were based in the UK in the years preceding Brexit, and you've kept a very close eye on events ever since. Your thoughts on how Brexit is so far measuring up to the promises and the warnings of 2016?
Well, Nella, there are two songs that come to my mind, and they'll only be relatable to people with gray hair. But one of them is Neil Sedaka and Breaking Up is Hard to Do. The other is Connie Francis singing Who's Sorry Now? And I think those two capture what was ignored in the first round and what's being ignored in the second round. Like Sir Graham said, the English nationalism, and remember the difference between the United Kingdom, Britain, and England. English nationalism is important. And when I was in the UK, I was shocked at how prevalent the flag of St. George was, which is the English national flag. And it's not just for the purpose of football or soccer or other sports. It really has resonance in the townships, in where people live. The other thing, in terms of the actual effects, the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is a parliamentary office, not a government office, has estimated that the cost of the pandemic to the United Kingdom has been about 2% of GDP. But the cost of Brexit has been 4% of GDP. And that's stunning. I mean, now, do people notice minus 4% in GDP? No, they don't. Because, and there's a chap I follow in the UK, a professor at UCL, who has this great analogy where he talks about this is not a blowout of a tire. This is a slow leak. And that's why the 4% gets lost in the noise around the pandemic and around everything else.
You talk about it being a slow leak. I mean, it's hard to ignore the headlines that are talking about a possible trade war, even at this stage, between the UK and the EU or members of the EU. Before we get to the reasons behind this particular spat, how realistic is it, do you think, Mel, that the Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister Boris Johnson, one of the Brexit's biggest champions, could be the architect of its collapse so early in its implementation?
Well, he'll never attribute the cause to that, although the public will recognize it. And, you know, if you watched the news yesterday, your colleagues on CBC reported the Peppa Pig speech. And if you haven't seen it, look it up on YouTube. It's brilliant. But Boris is, you know, I was saying to Sir Graham, the number 10 had to issue a press release saying that the Prime Minister has not lost his grip. I mean, this is bizarre. However, by the way, he hasn't beaten his wife this week either. The challenge, I think, for the public is to attribute causality. And for that matter, academics have trouble attributing causality. And so the public will have this distemper, this feeling of unease. And that's different than actually saying to the government, you're to blame. The other thing is that in this bilateral negotiation, which continues, remember, this is still ongoing. David Frost and Marko Sefcovic continue to meet and negotiate. And there's somebody to blame, and it's not a Brit. You can always blame Michel Barnier before, and now Sefcovic, as the negotiators for the Europeans. And so if we're not getting a good deal, it's not David Frost's problem or Boris Johnson's problem. It's because of those continentals.
Right. It's easy to blame the group you left, essentially. And it's actually a really good way to segue into the conversation about Europe and to explain a little bit of what's happening now, as you say, unless people haven't been paying attention. There has been a lot of hand-wringing over Northern Ireland. It is covered, just for those who may not know, it is covered by the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is a sub-deal to Brexit to ensure that there's no hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and remains as such as part of the EU's single market for goods. Now, Britain says that that part of the Brexit deal is not working, even though it agreed to it. Sir Graham, we also hear about fishing disputes and sausage wars and other irritants. Is there a sense in which Brexit has loosened, as a result, the fabric of the EU itself? Like, I'm curious what the impact has been on this political and economic union that the British left behind.
I think what's very clear, Nala, is when people voted in 2016, they voted to leave the European Union. They were voting against something. There were any number of possibilities for the United Kingdom outside the European Union. We could have been like Norway, still in the single market, still in economic Europe, if you like, but out of political Europe. We could have been like Turkey or Switzerland or Liechtenstein in the customs union, but not in the single market. What the government chose was an option far more like CETA negotiated with Canada. It was essentially a free trade agreement. And the cost of that was putting a border down the Irish Sea. The people who are paying the price for that are the people of Northern Ireland. And it is perhaps hardly surprising that some of them are beginning to wonder whether a reunification of the island might not be their best option for the future.
Indeed. I mean, we remember the day after the Brexit vote, there was talk immediately about the possibility of a reunification referendum being held in the wake of all this. I mean, does it feel like, what's the political temperature on the ground? Does it feel like things are closer to that kind of reality, Sir Graham?
Sure. I think nobody has much enthusiasm at the moment for a second referendum. It might have been an option. Remember that the vote was in 2016, but we didn't actually sign a withdrawal agreement until the end of 2019, 3 years later. And we didn't negotiate the future relationship until just over a year ago. It's all taken a long time. But at the same time, we have seen, as Mel said, the kind of flag-waving English nationalism in London, which is pushing Northern Ireland and Scotland to the limits of the Union. We have a culture secretary who's written to insist that that British flags be flown on all government buildings. We have a local government secretary who's instructed local authorities to do the same. We have a Home Secretary who's talked about whether we should remain within the European Convention for Human Rights. We have a former editor of The Sun who's even said, well, that's Brexit done, now for a referendum on the death penalty. This is quite worrying. I do not believe that the people running the country love their country. I think more they despise their neighbors. And I am with the French writer Albert Camus. J'aime trop mon pays pour être nationaliste.
Mel, you're laughing. Yeah, I'm just curious. Go ahead, please.
I want to push a little bit on the Northern Ireland point that you made. First of all, think about Canada-UK relations. Canada-EU relations. Canada has easier access to the European Union than the United Kingdom does. That's bizarre. That's weird. But there are two different agreements, and Graham mentioned the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with CETA, with the European Union. And that gives us actually a very good deal, including an environmental agreement and a labor agreement. And the UK, in the rush to get that 2019 agreement, actually didn't deal with a lot of other issues that have to be resolved, which is why they continue to negotiate. On Northern Ireland, though, I think that it is now inevitable that there will be a unification of the island. The Unionists, of course, will push back very vigorously. By very vigorously, I mean with violence. And we need to recognize that you need to find a political solution rather than a physical solution, a kinetic one. Having said that, I still worry about this because when you had a choice of whether to have a a border with the European Union, it had to be either at the 6 counties of Northern Ireland or in the Irish Sea. You can't not have a border. So here's the good news for Northern Ireland, that it is now better for Canadian companies and American companies and European companies, or everybody outside the EU, to invest in Northern Ireland because they have access to the UK, and they have access to the European Union. So I think Northern Ireland, if they play it right, can become an investment destination.
And possibly eventually engage in a vote on whether to stay in the UK at all. It's just as a segue, Mel. I want to just ask you this: is that it's been interesting to watch how the United States has sided with the EU on this whole Northern Ireland protocol. I mean, for obvious reasons. But where's Canada on this, and how does that sort of affect the political relationship between Canada and the UK?
If I drew a circle and made it square, that's where the Canadian policy is. We are trying to keep our good graces with one of our pays maternels and the other pays, the other mother country. And so part of this is we're trying to keep good graces on both sides. At the end of the day, from the private sector's perspective, and then I'll come to the government, the private sector's perspective is I have a choice of where to sell my products and where to invest my money and where to build my plants. I can go to a 300 million person market, or I can go to a 60 million person market. This is not rocket science. This requires some pretty simple arithmetic. And the EU looks a lot more attractive than the United Kingdom does. Having said that, language matters. And the UK, being an English country, actually makes it easier in terms of reducing transactions costs to locate there. So it isn't as simple as I'm making it out. I am oversimplifying, but at the end of the day, 300 million people and different regulatory regimes makes it very attractive to go to the continent.
So Graham, just again on the question of how this deal is playing out and how it affects all these different relationships. You know, the UK is quibbling over this deal at a time when it is attempting to forge new trade deals outside of the EU. What is all this uncertainty, you know, with a deal that was supposedly settled, due to the prospects of other trade deal alliances beyond the EU?
Well, you're absolutely right, Nala. One of the great boasts of those who wanted to leave the European Union is that Britain would be free to strike its own trade deals with the rest of the world. It was
Global Britain.
always nonsense. Germany trades more than twice as much than the UK does with the rest of the world, and it is very firmly anchored in the European Union. What the UK has done is to walk away from some 50 trade agreements that the European Union has, including with Canada, in the name of free trade. It makes no sense whatsoever. And what I fear is that my country has not only taken a wrong turn, but is making itself thoroughly obnoxious within the European Union with trying to renegotiate the deal once it's outside. That's what these talks between David Frost and Maros Šefčovič are all about. We could learn a lot from Canada, you know, about the power of inclusiveness, about the beauty of diversity, about the dynamism of the 3 T's, talent and technology and tolerance, and we need to.
How does it affect the UK's negotiating position? Like, I mean, does it make it harder to actually deliver that promise, do you think?
The UK's negotiating position is not understood or respected. We signed a withdrawal agreement with the European Union in 2019. We are now trying to go back on that agreement in respect of certain aspects of the Northern Ireland Protocol. We signed an agreement on future relations in 2020. We are now trying to go back on certain parts of that agreement. We are losing credibility and losing the patience of our European neighbours, on whom we depend for about half of our total trade.
Mel, also about the EU and how this is all playing out now, there had been some concern at the time of the vote that Brexit might blaze a path for other exits from the EU, that other countries might use this as a way out as well for various reasons. There are different reasons that we know of. But are there any indications at this stage that is happening, or is the UK perhaps becoming more of a cautionary tale?
I think it's the latter, Nella, and there are still dissenting views in many of the EU countries, the member states, and it plays out in the politics in very strange ways. Some of them are right-wing and some of them are left-wing who want to get out of the EU. Having said that, I think there's an element of this that's really important, which is the nature of complexity. And that is that this looks like, and Graham mentioned it earlier, people voted and they thought they were getting out. And why did it take 3 years to get a deal? Well, they still haven't resolved everything because it's all up in the air. It's bloody difficult. It's complicated. And as the complexity governs, I think the public in the EU is starting to realize that it's not so simple. The last point I'd make is that, and Graham made reference to this earlier, this is not about the economy and it's not about economics. It's about identity. And the way the tale of Britain's independence from the EU will play in Spain and other countries with independentist movements will be much more like a Quebec in Canada or a Saskatchewan in Canada, if I could say that, than it will be about Britain in the EU. And that therefore it gives voice to independentist movements. And frankly, and here we have a Scotsman sitting beside me, it'll play out in Scotland that way too.
And we'll talk about Scotland in a minute, but Sir Graham, your thoughts on whether Brexit, now that we're sort of, as you say, heading into it, it might still have a destabilization effect on the EU that's still to come?
Well, I don't exclude the possibility that it could, but I think what is interesting is that immediately after Brexit, the opinion polls showed a huge rise in support for European Union membership in the other countries. And I think the difficulty of the process has reinforced in the minds of the Continentals the need to build a much stronger and deeper European Union, a European Union that Britain as a member was resisting, was blocking it from happening. It's perhaps a rather happier continental Europe these days than it was when the UK, at least latterly, was a member. And I hope that there will be a little humility creeping into politics in the UK. Michel Barnier, the negotiator of this on the European side, has just published a diary of the negotiations called La Grande Illusion, The Great Illusion. And he refers to a 1937 film by Jean Reno, a very well-known one, Jean Renoir, which is about how it is an illusion to believe that you can go it alone in a world where the challenges that we face, challenges of population growth and migration, challenges of internationally organized crime linked to terrorism, challenges of climate and energy security, we need to be working with each other to deal and tackle these, not pulling apart.
Let me, speaking of challenges, let me challenge both of you in this way. What do you say, or can you imagine a scenario under which Brexit, again, in its very early days at the moment, might unfold differently, might be a more successful endeavor, had there been different leadership? And I'm not talking about just individuals, but just, the political situation in the UK. Could there be a more productive, constructive process if Prime Minister Boris Johnson were Prime Minister? Sir Graham.
Let me start, Graham, because you're the Brit. You'll actually have an authority. You're a politician. You'll have an authoritative answer. If I was still the High Commissioner, of course, I would ignore Nala's question entirely.
Of course you would.
Because I would not want to meddle in domestic politics in the UK. Having said that, let me give you my view. I think it totally could have played out differently. That and Keir Starmer isn't the leader that everyone hoped he would be for Labour and the Liberal Democrats. I think Nick Clegg, when he was in the Cameron, was Deputy Prime Minister to Cameron, never smiled for 3 years. And I don't think that they might have made a difference. I do think that even in the Conservative Party, a more disciplined and structured prime minister could have had a big effect on the way this played out. There was never, and Graham mentioned this earlier, there was never a facing of reality. Boris Johnson, was always playing games. He thought this was a piece of cake. He ignored the complexity and the difficulties. And, if I think of two former leaders of the party who are still in Parliament, William Hague or Ian Duncan Smith, they would have played it differently. And they would have had, they both understood the complexity of governing, and they would have had a structured and disciplined way to manage the negotiations. And I don't think that is true about this Conservative Party.
I would agree entirely with Mel. I think his analysis is a very incisive one. When a country goes wrong, invariably it begins to go wrong from the top. And we saw this not just in the Conservative Party with leaders who have been expensively educated at Harrow and Eton and Oxford and Cambridge. We saw it in the Labour Party as well, with Jeremy Corbyn as a leader who rather favoured the UK leaving the European Union. This was a breakdown of the political establishment. And perhaps it's time for the United Kingdom to recognise that the age of empire is over, that the United Kingdom needs a written constitution, that it needs constitutional safeguards that would not allow a referendum with, barely 52% of those voting in favour to determine the future of the country for generations to come. I suspect there will be, as a result of this, in the years to come, a radical rethinking of the United Kingdom itself. And as you suggest, Nala, it may not survive as one entity. I'm giving a lecture at the Bill Graham Centre for International Contemporary History on the 30th of November on precisely that point.
And we will end on that point before we go to audience questions. And I do want to remind the audience that you can be part of this conversation definitely before it's over. So please, if you have questions, just put them in the comments section if you're joining virtually. If you're in person, there's a microphone there and it will come to you if you put your hand up. So just a reminder on that. But I do want to just again press you on this. I mean, the subject of this conversation is to explore your views, and it's very clear, Sir Graham, certainly your personal views on this issue. But I do wonder now that Brexit is in place and Boris Johnson is Prime Minister, that whether you think those who were critics, like yourself, of the entire endeavour are doing enough to perhaps try to get the best Brexit possible, given that that is the situation that the UK finds itself in now.
I think it's a very fair point to make. There are people like myself who are very, very concerned about the situation that our country finds itself in. We are trying to move the discussion towards a re-evaluation, not about the principle of Brexit, that's done sadly and dusted, but about what the alternatives are to full membership of the European Union. Whether we might not look at, for example, going back into the Erasmus scheme, which allows students from the United Kingdom to go and study in other countries and students from other countries to come to the UK. Whether we might not try to go back into the European Space Agency, which helped us put the first Briton into space a few years ago, Tim Peake. Whether we might not look indeed even at going back into the single market at some point in time, since it is so clearly in our economic interests. But that is a discussion that will take, I fear, at least a generation. In the meantime, we've to live with a government which is rather fraying at the edges.
I would just add, Nella, that I
Yep.
agree totally. But the only thing I would add is that the way the European Union was structured and functioned, and Graham knows this way better than I do, the UK took decisions from Brussels. I think that's true. But they also had input to those decisions. They could affect the way those decisions were made. The meetings of the leaders of governments took place every 6 weeks, and they could influence the kinds of decisions that were going to be taken. And now they are regulatory takers, and they have no influence. But I do think that the variable geometry that Sir Graham described is indeed a possible outcome in the future. Remember that when the euro was created, the United Kingdom was one of 3 countries that did not adopt the euro. Even within the European Union, there was this flexibility and variable geometry. And I think that may be the future of the UK and the EU, as opposed to the future of the UK in the EU.
I think that's absolute.
Go ahead, please, Sir Graham.
Sorry, Mel. I was going to agree with Mel. I think that's right. If you look, for example, at Mrs. Thatcher's government, to which Boris Johnson swears fealty, this was the government which created the European single market. This was the government that had the vision to enlarge the European Union, to embrace the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, which were escaping from communism. It was, in fact, one of the most pro-European governments we ever had. And to be retreating from that, to be retreating from the idea that Churchill had after the war of a common citizenship and a wider patriotism for what he called the distraught peoples of this powerful and turbulent continent, we need to find that again. What we need to be doing is, as the French and the Germans are doing, to forge within the smithy of our souls the conscience of a continent.
At the risk of ending at least my line of questioning on sort of a downer, I do want to ask about Scotland. And again, like the memory of what was going on with Ireland, I remember, Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, appearing very early in the morning, the day after the vote, or the day the results came out, saying that she would begin to lay the groundwork for another referendum in separating from the UK. Sir Graham, I'll start with you. Is the political ground ready, not shifting, but ready, given how Brexit is proceeding at the moment?
I think the difficulty, Nala, is that the SNP have to convince people, the Scottish National Party has to convince people, first of all, that it can govern effectively in areas like health and education and transport and so on. And secondly, that it has a credible plan, if Scotland were to leave the United Kingdom, for how it deals with the national debt and the deficit, which are quite substantial, and how it deals with the currency in the period between leaving the United Kingdom and rejoining the European Union, as they say they want to. Most people in Scotland are not yet convinced that those plans are there. It looks a wee bit too much like Catalonia, to be honest.
But do you get the sense that people might be swayed or more easily swayed, given, as you say, that the promises of Brexit are still incoming?
Indeed, they might, and the majority was there to re-elect the Scottish National Party to government just 6 months ago. They've been given the license to develop those ideas and to develop the authority to do it. Let's see whether they can.
I would just add, just to make reference to popular culture for a minute, I've been watching Shetland on Netflix or on Amazon. It's a great performance. I recommend it to everybody. But but the point of this is that there is a different tradition in Scotland, whether it's a reference to the procurator fiscal and the links to when Mary de Guise brought the French into Scotland, and you had a continental perspective in Scotland where you have a civil law tradition as opposed to the common law in England. I mean, these traditions give it a different perspective on the world. And they, in a way, the Scots are much more open to the world. And we're talking about, Graham, you were talking about Brexit coming at a time, withdrawing from a world that is becoming more interdependent and more connected all the time. And the Scots, I think, are much more open to that internationalism.
I will pause there. Thank you, both of you. I mean, there are 100 more questions I could ask, but I'll leave it there for a minute, just to maybe try to bring in others who may have questions. Here's a question online, actually, that's come in virtually, from Akash Maharaj. De Gaulle famously objected to Britain's accession to Europe, saying it would try to poison the pan-European project from the inside. Does Brexit prove him right? Is the EU the true winner of Brexit? So, Sir Graham, we'll start with you.
No, I think Brexit doesn't prove him right. One of Europe's biggest difficulties was that there were two countries that had fundamental questions about sovereignty when they entered the European Union. One of those was the United Kingdom. The other was France. The French were far more intelligent with their diplomacy than the United Kingdom ever was. They advanced their own interests under the banner of Europeanism. And we in Britain were not quite up to that level of intellect, if you like. I think the real issue is this. The Europeans from all countries want to be together. And to me, the image that remains in my mind is the image of members of the European Parliament meeting in Strasbourg on the day on which the United Kingdom left the European Union. They broke out in song. What were they singing? They weren't singing the European national anthem. They weren't singing God Save the Queen. They were singing Auld Lang Syne, the Scottish song about how good it is to be together. And I suspect that the future of Europe's nations lies together. We've just got to find a way of bringing the United Kingdom cat, coaxing it back down from its tree.
That's quite an image.
Akash, since I'm giving television recommendations, Akash raises the poison from within, and there's a wonderful segment in Yes Minister, and you can find it on YouTube, where and this is Jonathan Lynn's brilliant insight, that the Brits, of course, have been against European integration for 500 years, and the best way to thwart it is to enter it. And that's such a Yes Minister kind of initiative. But the other thing, and linking it to France, as Akash does, is right, because remember who objected to the Brits joining the Union originally, and it was de Gaulle. And de Gaulle, who had sought refuge in London during the war. And he said, I know those people. We don't want them.
Sought refuge and sought help too in the liberation. So there's a question also on the ground, I think, on the ground, but you know what I mean, in the room. Someone with a mic, I believe. Yes.
Yes. So I have a question in two parts. The first one is, what will happen in Europe when they consider expanding Europe? My question is basically lessons learned. Are there ways in which Europe will think differently about expansion? And in terms of lessons learned, is there anything from that saga that we can learn? Are other places where there's movement to create a free market, like, you know, in the continent of Africa, for example, where there's movement of bringing people together, countries together to create different markets, different unions, and so on. Lessons learned.
Thank you. Sir Graham, go
This
ahead.
this is where we both say, after you, Alphonse.
Well, how about both of you?
There is one of the reasons why there was pressure in the United Kingdom to leave the European Union was the fact that when Bulgaria and Romania joined the Union in 2007, any member state could allow people from Bulgaria or Romania to come into their country to work, or they could choose to say, well, we'll have a period of 4 years after which you'll be allowed to come. The United Kingdom welcomed people from Bulgaria and Romania. Almost no other country did. And so any Bulgarians or Romanians wanting to go to work abroad went to the UK. That had a downward pressure on wages. I have no doubt about it. And it was one of the factors that was exploited in the run-up to Brexit. I think if the European Union were to bring in any other substantially sized country, it might want to take that kind of factor into consideration. It's likely to expand over the coming years to some of the smaller countries of the Western Balkans. But if there was ever a question of Ukraine or perhaps Turkey one day joining the European Union, I'm sure that freedom of movement of labor would be an issue to be discussed.
I think, I mean, it's a fascinating question about the application of these lessons. But in thinking about other continents, I think the notion we were talking about earlier of variable geometry for different purposes is a lesson. So if you think about the African Union actually has played a very important role in some countries at some times, not always, in doing peacekeeping and peace building. And they have credibility that former colonial powers wouldn't. We, as having been colonized by two former colonial powers, may have a little bit of credibility. But the point is that you could choose mobility of people for some purposes for African integration. And you could use a common market for different purposes. You could use, you might do it by sector, as the coal and steel community did originally. So you could do it in different ways. And I think if there's a lesson, it's that you need to construct a new institution for purpose.
Thank you. Thank you both for that. I understand there's another question also from the room.
Yeah, just a quick question. How can Canada best take advantage of Britain's disorganization and desire for a more significant role in the world, both economically and politically?
Mel, that's a natural.
I think you need to be deliberate about it, frankly. I think there are still many global leaders based in the UK. The City of London is not going to disappear as a financial hub. I think it is going to lose a lot. Well, it has lost a lot of its cachet and a lot of its strength, but it's still going to be a financial powerhouse. So I would say be very deliberate about it. I would do it by sector. I would be very, I kind of hope that as we negotiate with the Brits for a free trade agreement, that I'll be able to get British cheddar because we'll give up our own dairy supply management. But that's as a consumer. The chances of that are about, minus 10%. So I'm not that hopeful. But the point is, there are different issues that we're going to negotiate with the United Kingdom than we negotiated with the European Union. So even though they're getting out of the common agricultural policy, it's still there. That was a large part of the negotiations between for CETA. With the Brits, it's going to be for different things. And standing here in the property of the University of Toronto, I know this is not a University of Toronto property, that we should think about what Graham said about Erasmus. We should try to get involved in academic post-secondary relations with good universities in the United Kingdom.
Very good. Thank you. Was there one more from the room there?
Yeah.
Yes, thanks very much for the conversation. Very helpful. But when you first spoke, Sir Graham, about English nationalism, and then a little while later, you both mentioned the issue of identity. My mind immediately went to Scotland, and it went to Scotland. And what I was thinking about it in that context is it the potential for a domino effect with respect to reunification of Ireland, with respect to Welsh nationalism, etc. And the reason I say that, and I was laughing when Nyla posed her question on Scotland, because we tried economic rationalism as a counter argument to Quebec independence. And it didn't go very far because it's an emotional identity, nationalistic origins, all of these movements. And so I was thinking, well, that's not going to go over very well. And of course, being able to enter the EU again answers that economic argument quite easily. So my question really is, like, are you worried, or can you identify triggers that might happen that create that momentum, whether it's trickle or whether it's kind of an inflection point that comes from, say, a human rights withdrawal on the part of, the MP you mentioned, or whether it's the placement of nuclear weapons in Scotland? Are you concerned, or can you identify triggers that might in fact ignite Scottish independence that then becomes the domino for these other movements? Thank you.
That's a very intelligent question. I can think of two triggers in particular, which will, one imagines, come in the coming years, in the coming decade, perhaps. The first is the death, sad but inevitable for all of us, of the ruling monarch, who is a figure who holds the United Kingdom together. The second would be a border poll in Northern Ireland on reunification of the two parts of the island. Those would both have, I think, a big impact on Scotland. But I think you need to look at the history of the union of Scotland and England and recognize that Scotland joined voluntarily. Well, we were bankrupt at the time, but we joined voluntarily because we believed that there were advantages to be gained from joining the English in building empire. And if you want to know how successful we were, just look at Canada today. But, if the English are able to convince Scotland that there are advantages to be gained in some new venture, then perhaps they can keep the union together again.
I would just add that I hadn't thought about the nuclear item that you mentioned, and I think that's exactly one that could be there, but it could play in exactly the opposite way, because Faslane in Scotland is the home of the British nuclear fleet, and if they decided not to renew tridents at some point, then it's conceivable that would have a negative effect on Scotland to the point where you have a negative trigger. But I just think it's going to be an incident that's going to be used for purpose by. I'm always fascinated by the fact that the two former first ministers and current first minister are named after fish, sturgeon and salmon. And I think fish is another one of those issues that could blow up. And we're seeing it now in Jersey and Guernsey. So who knows?
Thank you very much for that question and for those answers. One last one, I believe, from the room as well.
So I'll follow the intelligent question with a cheeky question. As you were just, in dialogue and talking about all the people involved, I actually thought these are a lot of men's names, right? Until we got to Margaret Thatcher and Nicola Sturgeon, who were both presented as people.
And the Queen.
And the Queen. Well, I don't know. Yes, the Queen, but people presented as being more for integration. So I'm not, obviously analyzing or counting, but I'm just wondering if there's a gender divide on this. Where are the women on this?
Boy, that is a loaded question. I think there's something to this. I think it's oversimplifying to think that it's simply testosterone that forced Brexit. Having said that, that identity point plays out in a different way by gender, and Graham mentioned the demographic or the national differences, but there was a polling right after 2016 which showed that women were more Remainers than Leavers. So there may well be something in that.
Yeah, that could be.
I believe that was the end of our questions. If I'm mistaken, please let me know. And if that's the case, I have one last one, and it actually touches a little bit on something you both have already spoken to just briefly, but just as a final thought, I wondered if you think it is too soon to imagine the conditions under which Britain might make its way back to some future version of the EU. What do you think it would take?
I'll give a one-word answer: leadership.
Okay. I think that's right. You know, the more you look at the way in which the world is developing, the more you recognize that we are going to have to come together, not just occasionally in conferences like the Glasgow Conference on Climate Change, but on a much more regular basis to deal with challenges that are global challenges. And it may be that the United Kingdom can be instrumental in helping to shape a world where people are again brought together. We're in a terrible conflict, at least a war of words, but actually a war of trade already with the Chinese. We can't afford that in the long term. We're in a conflict, a military conflict with the Russians. We can't afford that in the long term. Maybe the United Kingdom still has a role to play on the basis of having once dominated large parts of the globe and having learned something from it.
And don't underestimate the importance of the P5, the UK being one of the permanent 5 members of the United Nations Security Council. That matters. And if I were Scotland, I'd be thinking very carefully about whether I want to line up with them or not.
Sir Graham Watson, Mel Cap, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to speak with both of you. So much knowledge still untapped, and hopefully we have another chance again. Thanks to all of you for your questions and for tuning in. That does conclude our discussion for today. From me, Nala Ayed, thank you and stay safe.